bring me to Holy Prophet via Jibreel, and therefore it should not be amended. Certainly, about inheritance, just one more point, and that is, of course, the Quran gave ladies, women, the rights of inheritance 1400 years ago. The rights of inheritance were only given to the British in 1892 following the enactment. So this is something we are very, very proud of indeed. About hitting a woman, I dare not touch my wife actually. She thinks if I hit her once, she's going to hit me 10 times. So I don't think that is happening very much. Interesting point you made about Africa. In fact, we had a debate in the House of Lords. I was born in Kenya, brought up in Uganda, and therefore we talked about governance in Africa. And of course, we remember Macron's speech, The Wind of Change. And of course, what happened there was that when Britain gave independence to the African countries, they expected the Africans to follow the white-collar system of democracy. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. Because what they did was they swayed towards one-party system. But I'm very, very glad that there's now democracy in lots of countries in Africa. I mean, Ghana is a very, very good country. And the point you made about indeed getting a coalition. In fact, about 6 weeks ago, I was part of a parliamentary delegation to Nepal. And this is exactly what they have done. They were a coalition. They got, in fact, proportional representation, and 1/3 of parliamentarians in Nepal are women, and the untouchable. So I think the point you make about the continental system, I think is so very, very vital. I think we should not forget that the Westminster form of democracy is not the only one. We need to have a system which is prevalent, which is compatible with the condition. I think this is so very, very vital. Thank you indeed, Andy, for that excellent presentation. Thank you indeed. Now, our next speaker is our professor, Professor Madhavi Al-Rashid. She is Professor of Anthropology of Religion at King's College, London. The professor has written books and articles in academic journals on 19th century history in the Arabian Peninsula and contemporary 20th century issues relating to the formation of the modern state. She has conducted research on Arab migration with special focus on the Iraqi community in London. The professor also conducted research on Gulf transnationalism and heritage, drawing special attention to forces of globalization and the incorporation of the Arab Gulf in global flows. And currently, the professor involved in a research project examining transformation of religious discourse in Saudi Arabia, especially after the events of 11th of September 2001. So, Professor, please make your presentation. No, you Professor, take this, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank Mr. Boto for this invitation, this opportunity to address this distinguished audience. As I was introduced, I'm an academic. I do research on the Middle East in general, and I have ventured into studying the society that hosted me since 1983, mainly London. The question that I would like to start with is whether Islam and democracy are compatible. I think the question in its format is actually a reductionist question, and somehow it is flawed. I think the question tries to compare world religion with a universal message through a political system situated in a historical context and with variants across the globe. We have been given examples of how democracy varies. We have the continental model, we have the British model, and we also have the American model. We have democracies with presidents, democracies with prime ministers, democracies also with kings and queens. And therefore, it is very difficult to see how we could compare a world religion with a universal message that goes beyond the political system and managing the public affairs of a particular community. As a world religion, Islam goes beyond the political system, and indeed it covers aspects of the way people organize their life together, husband and wife, inheritance, marriage, divorce, but also it can organize people's economic life, political affairs, and even foreign relations. War is regulated in Islam. Now, to go back to the Quran, I think what the mistake we make these days is thinking that to every single contemporary modern issue that the Muslim communities face across the globe, we can go back to this Quran and we find answers. Even Muslims themselves, they have to go back to some texts, to some interpretations that are not sacred like the Quran. If the majority of Muslims today believe that the Quran is the revealed word of God, but as a book, as a text, for those of us who can read it in the original, its original language, Arabic, we realize that a lot of our contemporary affairs are governed by interpretations of people who are specialists in that kind of work. But today, as we have a crisis of authority in Islam, we have multiple interpretations of the religious text. And therefore, there isn't a single interpretation that all Muslims can actually go back to. Today, with globalization and transnational connections, most Muslims may not refer to the specialists in religious interpretation, whether we call them mullah, imams, or jurists, for example, faqih, but they may go to the internet and Mr. Google will promise to provide interpretations and answers to most of the problems facing Muslims today at individual level and also as communities. So what I'm going to talk about here is there are three areas that I would like to share with you. The first one is to give you a historical background. Second one is imagined obstacles to democracy in the Muslim world, and imagined is in inverted commas. Then thirdly, I would like to discuss with you the real obstacles to democracy, as it hasn't manifested itself across the Muslim world. It has appeared in some countries, but not everywhere. And finally, I would like to make some suggestions about what we do as Muslims and also as people who are in constant scrutiny and observation from people outside the Muslim world. So let me start with the historical background. In the Quran, there isn't a political system. There isn't a platform that tells us how we could govern ourselves as Muslims. In fact, the first schism that happened in Islam in the 7th century took place after the death of the Prophet, because the Prophet, according to the majority of Muslims, did not designate a successor. Some challenged this statement, and we could discuss that. And there are certain hadith, which are the deeds and the words of the Prophet, that remind Muslims that the Prophet argued to the Muslims that it is up to them to decide on how they manage their contemporary affairs. And therefore, the first schism, which resulted in the Sunni-Shia divide from the 7th century until the present day, was actually centered on the fact that there wasn't a clear statement in the Quran which says how Muslims should govern themselves. Now, the Muslims throughout history, they had different ways of governing themselves. And the community of Medina, where the Prophet migrated and established the first city-state, if you like, was the state of prophecy. The community of Medina was governed by